fine. It's fine.
This is a wonderful full house, such a great crowd. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Concord Museum. I'm Lisa Krasner, I'm the Edward W. Kane Executive Director, and thank you all for joining us tonight, both those who are here in person in the Churchill and Janet Franklin Lyceum, and to many, many virtual viewers we have online. We will also be recording this as well. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight's forum, which is a conversation with Governor Charlie Baker and his longtime associate Stephen Kadish, discussing their method for getting past politics and delivering results in the public and private sectors. Their book, Results, Getting Beyond Politics to Get Important Work Done, is not only about getting things done, but about renewing people's faith in public service. Charlie Baker served as the 72nd governor of Massachusetts from 2015 to 2023, winning re-election in a landslide, and was consistently ranked as the most popular governor in America. He is credited with bringing bipartisan leadership to the state, successfully guiding Massachusetts through exceptionally turbulent periods. He led the Commonwealth out of $1 billion budget deficit and into a surplus while cutting taxes and boosting investments in education and infrastructure. In addition to his 2 terms as governor, he has decades of experience spearheading transformations at high-profile institutions in the private and public sectors. Baker held 2 cabinet positions prior to becoming governor of the Commonwealth, serving as the Secretary of Administration and Finance from 1994 to 1998, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services from 1992 to 1994. He also served as the CEO of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Governor Baker became the NCAA's 6th president in March of 2023 and has pursued a mission to improve the student-athlete experience, increase national office efficiency, and advocate for college sports. In less than 2 years, he expanded support for student-athletes by launching a post-eligibility insurance program for all 3 divisions and worked with membership to enact Division I core guarantees, such as mandatory health and wellness benefits for student athletes and new academic protections, such as guaranteed scholarships if a student athlete stops competing. He led the negotiation of a landmark media rights agreement with ESPN, increasing visibility for college athletes as they compete for a national championship. Additionally, Baker initiated the development of a fan database that will enrich the atmosphere for student athletes competing, increase fan attendance, and drive innovative ideas to enhance the championship experience for all. Baker is a graduate of Harvard, where he was a member of the men's varsity basketball team. He holds a Master of Business Administration from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. And Steve Kadish is an executive problem solver who has worked in the public and private sectors as COO, CFO, and big projects lead for over 30 years. Kadish served as Governor Charlie Baker's first chief of staff and then as a senior research fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. He is currently a senior advisor at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. His past roles include Undersecretary for Massachusetts Health and Human Services, Assistant Secretary for Massachusetts Administration and Finance, Assistant Commissioner at Massachusetts Medicaid, Chief Financial Officer at Dartmouth College, Chief Operating Officer at Northeastern University, Director of Global Health Equity at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Senior Vice President at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Kadish has also served as a special advisor to the Massachusetts COVID-19 Command Center, has served on local nonprofit service boards, and has worked as a consultant to the World Bank. Kadish and Governor Baker co-authored Results, Getting Beyond Politics to Get Important Work Done, published in May 2022 by Harvard Business Review. Now in its 2nd printing, the book provides a 4-part practical approach to tackling problems and case studies, which they will share this evening. I also want to extend a very special thank you to Claire and Joshua Nelson for the support of the museum's forums for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, as well as the Sally Lanigan Fund for generously endowing our forum series. And after tonight's forum, we'll have a book signing and reception in Burke Hall where you entered, and I hope everyone can stay for the gathering. So please join me in welcoming Charlie Baker and Steve Kadish.
Quite an introduction. Can I have a copy of that? I'd love to show it to my kids.
Sign it for him, Lisa.
falls into the category of my dad would appreciate it, my mom might believe it.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, thank you, and thank you all for joining us this evening. To everyone here in this room and all those at home, welcome. We're delighted to be here and deeply impressed that all of you wanted to come out on a Thursday night in late January, in the middle of a New England winter, to talk about a nonpartisan approach to getting things done in the public sector. Like, wow, right? I'm Steve Kadish. I'll be facilitating this conversation with Governor Baker. Through quotes, excerpts, and questions, we hope that you'll learn something about our approach to tackling complicated problems, have some fun, and maybe find some hope or inspiration. What an honor to be part of the events that celebrate the 250th anniversary of the shot heard around the world at the battles of Concord and Lexington. Governor Baker and I want to thank the Concord Museum and its Board of Governors for inviting us to speak, and thank the Nelson and Lanigan families for their support of the forums and the museum's 250th programming. And we especially want to say thank you to Allison and Lisa for making this whole event happen. So thank you. Thank you all for being here. Okay. Are you guys ready? Are you ready? Okay.
I'm ready, Steve.
Okay, we'll see. Okay, let's get going. Presidential inaugural, Martin Luther King holiday, NCAA football championship. How the heck does all that happen on one day? So I want to start with the current context. So much has happened from the White House since inauguration that it's hard to fathom, impacting so many services and potentially affecting so many lives. I don't remember when we were working together this immediate swirl of activity when Trump first took office. So this is my first question to you. What was it like for you as governor when the Trump administration began in 2017, 8 years ago, and how do you compare it now to then?
Well, I think the biggest difference was we have here something that's unusual, which is a second term that's not consecutive, right? I mean, most of the time, somebody wins, runs for election, and either wins or loses again, and then and that's it. Because at the presidential level, you can't run for more than 2 terms. But what you have here is a situation where somebody who had the job left the job and came back, and so they know through the course of their campaign a lot more about what the TikTok, probably a bad term, what the clock looks like when you come back for the second time. And the other thing that's different is, he knows far more people than he knew the first time. I mean, he ran the first time as a real outsider. And if you look at sort of how he went about creating his senior team and his cabinet the first time, there's a lot of people who he had not been around or spent much time with. And this time, almost everybody who's showing up as presidential appointees are people that have history. And so the fact that stuff is happening more quickly, I think is kind of, the reason it seems odd is because it's the start of a non-consecutive second term. But if this was a second term of a consecutive administration, the fact that stuff is going quickly wouldn't be that surprising. The other thing I would say is that when I think about our second term, right, it was almost like just business as usual. We all just showed up the day after the election and the second inauguration and just kind of, been here, done that, and this is more of a second term. And I also think that they probably started planning on a second administration significantly in advance of when they would have been doing that the first time, So the first part of your question was the difference at the beginning?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to step us back a little bit. And And so who is this? You could stand up for just a second. So,
Are you serious?
yeah. So,
Just so you know, Steve and I, you should sit down for a minute.
no, you're gonna stand up.
All right.
Okay.
You should
So,
not.
he's tall.
Some of you
Okay.
know this. Some of you know this because, if I ask for a show of hands of the people who've worked with me or Steve for the last 20 years, at least half. By the way, nice job stacking the room there. But the thing we met in right after
1990.
right after Bill Weld got elected, okay, in 1990. I worked on Weld's campaign, and I went to work in his administration. Never worked in state government before, and I was going through this process of just talking to people about what they were working on and what was in the transition documents and all the rest, and this guy shows up in my office with this notion that if we consolidated a bunch of the state's institutional healthcare institutions, we could come up with better answers for a lot of the people who are being served there and save about $60 million that we could turn around and reinvest in public health. And I remember thinking at the time, that's an interesting idea. And Governor Weld put together a task force. The task force spent just about a year working on that. I was the day-to-day on it, but Steve was doing most of the work and I was taking most of the credit. And we ended up implementing it, and it worked pretty much according to plan. And that was the first of 5 different times over the next 20 years or so that he and I worked together on stuff. And there are a lot of people who think that everything I ever did well is his fault, and everything I ever did badly is my fault. And I have a hard time arguing with that.
He is you are so kind. So I'm gonna read from here, but I'm actually reading a teeny bit from the book. And it's about Charlie, about Governor Baker. I will call this man Governor Baker forever. So I, Charlie, grew up the son of a moderate Republican father who worked in the Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan administrations, and a liberal Democratic mother, a fierce advocate for education and services to support the most vulnerable in our community. Charlie Sr. was an Assistant Secretary of Transportation under President Nixon and the Undersecretary for Health and Human Services under President Reagan. He staunchly believed in service and sacrifice. If my father gave me a vision of government service, my mother, Betty, gave me simple practice. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, she was fond of saying. If you're not listening, you're not learning. So, Governor, please tell us what it was like growing up with a mom who was a Democrat and a dad who was a Republican.
It was entertaining. My parents used to, Sunday nights, dinners at our house were hilarious. And there are a lot of people who literally would come just to sort of watch. And because that was the same day that, in the old days, right, that was the same day when everybody sat down and they read the New York Times and the Boston Globe, and they watched 60 Minutes and they listened to the shows in the morning. And so my parents would sit down and then have at it over the news of the week. And the thing, some people only came once, because if you came, you would start getting asked questions, and you would be expected to participate fully in the conversation. And that was fun for some people and not so much fun for others. But the big lesson I took away from it was this was a conversation, right? And these guys were actually listening to each other and responding to what the other one was saying. And no one was trying to win the debate. They were just talking. And if you didn't listen to what the other person was saying as their point and respond to whatever their point was, if you got into the what about it or whatever, you would be put in the penalty box, and you wouldn't be allowed to, offer any thoughts till my parents thought it was appropriate to let you back in. And this happened it didn't happen every week, but it happened a lot. And it really was, in some respects, where I came to believe that my father's expression, which was a little different than my mom's, was your receiver's more important than your transmitter. And they both were big believers that you get a lot smarter by listening and learning from others than you do assuming you know everything you need to know.
Yeah.
And that was the biggest lesson I got from them.
So I'm going to go through a couple of slides while I'm doing questions. So this is a relatively old slide. Let's see. Okay. Oh. Help me. Great. Okay. So that's 10 years ago, before the big snows of the winter of 25. We're probably discussing Hamilton tickets there because Hamilton just started about 10 years ago. But
You were so annoying about Hamilton.
By the time, so Governor Baker and I, he's a lifelong Republican, I'm a lifelong Democrat. We had worked together 4 times before this. This was the 5th time. And we had developed a methodology from moving from identifying problems to achieving results. And it grew out of our experiences in the government and was shaped by our experiences in the private sector. So, Governor, you've been Secretary of Administration and Finance, Secretary of Health and Human Services. Then you were at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, where you took over an entity that was in the equivalent of bankruptcy to become one of the leading health plans in the nation. When you became governor, what did you bring from your experience in the public sector? And what did you bring from your experience at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare?
The biggest thing from the Harvard Pilgrim experience was, well, some of it is in this book. The people you choose to work with will go a long way to determining whether or not you succeed. And when I went to Harvard Pilgrim, we put together a really good team. I actually went to Harvard Vanguard, what was then Harvard Vanguard Medical Associates, which was a physician group, multi-specialty group, that was affiliated with Harvard Pilgrim. It's now Atrius. And I basically got a battlefield promotion to become the CEO of Harvard Pilgrim because Harvard Pilgrim was in terrible financial shape, and I don't think anybody else wanted the job at that time. And I took it, but I brought with me a whole bunch of really talented people to work on the turnaround. And to this day, I believe that turnaround wouldn't have worked if it hadn't been for Luis Gutierrez, who came in and became the chief technology officer, and to this day is one of the most talented sort of tech/process business people I've ever met in my life. And when I met Luis when I was working at Health and Human Services, and he is very shy, very soft-spoken guy, and he came into my office because he had been nominated by somebody to serve on the Public Health Council. And he comes in and he speaks almost like in a whisper. And I was like, come on, boy, talk to me. And it became really clear to me he's really smart. And so I put him on the Public Health Council. And then we were looking for somebody to run the IT operations at Health and Human Services. And so I called him up and I said, you do a lot of IT consulting. Would you like to come work in state government? And he said, he thought about it and he said, yeah, sure, I'll come do that. And then when I went to A&F, I brought him with me. And by himself, he built the first data warehouse in state government history. By himself, sleeping on a cot night after night in his office. That's the kind of guy this guy was. And so when I went to Harvard Pilgrim and I was looking for a whole bunch of people who would be willing to do things like sleep on their cot, because we didn't have any time or any money or any runway. He was at that point the number 2 guy at the Federal Reserve Bank, number 2 guy at the IT shop at the Federal Reserve Bank. And I called him up and I said, you know, how would you like to come be the CIO of Harvard Pilgrim? And he said, let me call you back. And he called me back about 20 minutes later and said, yeah, I'll come do that. And the guy was so good at what he was expected to do that it's just breathtaking to me even now. And, you know, there's a story in here about him in this book because he's the guy that fixed the state's health connector after we took office. And you know, people are so important. And that was probably the single biggest lesson I learned from the whole Harvard Pilgrim thing. You know, I brought in you. Steve, Harvard Pilgrim had never finished a project, I don't think, ever, when we showed up there. All they would do was they would move on the charts, right? They would just move the completion date, right? So it was still green, right? You'd be like, dude, this thing, your original date on this was like forever ago. And it's, so we created a project management office. And he was in charge of it. And so we had this first day where we brought all the senior leaders in, and this is literally, we've been there for maybe a day or two, and Steve goes up and he starts putting yellow stickies on the wall, because this was the day before, long before we had stuff like this, and we're putting like the big list of all the problems. This was like, it's okay to talk about what doesn't work here. Just you have full permission to tell us about everything that doesn't work. And so people eventually believed us when someone would tell us something that didn't work. We'd write a sticky down, put it on the wall. And we say, okay, what's next? And people are like, I'm not going to get like fired for saying that thing isn't going to work. And so eventually we're done. And now it's like lunchtime. And we have this huge wall full of yellow stickies. And I look out and I say, so anything else? Like, this is a good list, but anybody got any? Nobody had anything else, right? And you know how sometimes the really sticky hairball that no one wants to talk about, even when you give them permission, they have trouble coughing it up? So we're literally about to walk out, and this guy raises his hand, and this is when this would have been like, I'm going to say September, June-ish of, it was June, July-ish of 1999, right? This guy raises his hand, and Bob Trombley will remember what this guy said. And he goes, we don't have a Y2K plan. Now, we've been talking about, like, it's open season. You can tell us anything about what's wrong, and no value judgments. We just need to get it all on the board. And yet, we had to be almost off to lunch before this guy was willing to raise his hand and say, we don't have a Y2K plan. So in the end, honestly, it's all about the people. There's really, that's where the magic happens. You get the right people and in the right roles, and you believe them and you support them. Crazy things happen.
So here's our
is,
incredibly complex four-part results framework. People are policy, follow the facts, focus on how, push for results. This came from a lot of things that worked and didn't work, both public sector and private sector. And so this, in the first half of the book, there's a chapter on each one of these. In the second half of the book, there are stories. So I'm going to throw back at you one of the very big things that we had both worked in the public sector first, and then went to Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, and then back in the public sector, not consecutively. But one of the big things that we took from working at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare is performance metrics, and that in the public sector, it's better now, but at that time there was very little measurement of, are you actually getting done what you said you'd get done, and how are you doing with the services? And that final push for results and making sure that it happened was really important. Here's
for the metrics to work, by the way, you do need to have people who are like willing to be held accountable to them. And the one other thing I would say about metrics, and I can't remember if you and I talking about this tonight, is we're not big fans of averages in metrics. And the reason why is an average is just a mathematical computation. It doesn't necessarily tell you what's really going on. So, you know, for example, one of the things that we got into pretty early on in our first term was there was definitely something going on with caseloads at DCF, okay? But when you asked for what the average was, it was 18, which was consistent with what the contract with the union said was the right number, right? But there were definitely offices where it was pretty clear to us something was just not quite right. So what we did was we said there's 27 area offices. What's the average caseload in each of the 27 area offices, and then how big are the tails, right? And so what ended up happening was there were some offices that had averages that were significantly below 18, some that had averages that were over 18, which is how you end up with the 18 across the board. And then there were offices where you did not have a distribution that looked like this, right? You had a distribution that looked like that. And so you had a ton of people out here who were carrying like 24, 25, 26 in an office where you also had a bunch of people, because they were new, who were carrying like 8, 9, or 10. So combined, it looked like 18. But this thing out here, that is a problem just waiting to happen. And so the whole approach to this thing from the beginning was to deal with the tails and to take some of what the best of the 27 offices were doing and bring it to the other ones, because they weren't all the same.
Great. So that was a very good lead into the, in part, follow the facts, and you've just talked a lot about people or policy. I think this is a real sweet story that I just want to read that we talk about in the book. There are two kinds of facts that we chase: data evidence, hard data, reports, metrics, financials, etc. And then also points of pain, and these are the real life stories of people who are being served by the programs, also from the folks that are providing the services and the staff. So taken together, they give you a real nice sense of defining the problem and where the potential interventions are to fix it. So you will remember that rural broadband was a huge problem when you took office in 53 of the western Massachusetts towns. You started with people, did a reset there, you did an intense follow the facts, and I want to read this story. As of the fall of 2021, 50 of the 53 rural towns have new service, and the remaining 3 are in various phases of implementation. For the hamlet of Mount Washington, with just 150 households, the change wasn't only about the internet. As told to Government Technology magazine, Brian Tobin, a select board member, observed, "In the 13 years before we had high-speed internet, there wasn't a single child born to any couple in the town of Mount Washington. In 2 years, 5 children have been born, and new couples have moved in. So I don't know what I would attribute it to broadband or anything else, but I can tell you it's a big difference in a small community where we were losing population as older folks passed on." You found the whole broadband thing so important and so compelling. Can you talk about it for a minute?
So this was, in fact, one of the biggest and most interesting and I think important things we did. And it really doesn't get a lot of attention because it happened in a bunch of communities that are very small and really spread out, the so-called hill towns in Massachusetts. And part of the reason they didn't have broadband is because they were the hill towns, right? We ended up, I can't remember which one in particular, but there was one town where we put in 4,000 telephone poles, and there were 2,000 people who lived there. The thing that was really interesting about this is the lieutenant governor and I did a visitation with all of the local officials in Western Mass. I don't remember exactly when it was. We were invited out there by Stan Rosenberg, who was the Senate president at that point.
Yeah.
And just person after person came up and sat down at this table across from us and talked about this and said, you know, this is like drinking water. This is like electricity. We do not have this. You know, kids are doing homework, sitting next to the library, drafting off the library's technology. You know, the fire chief, who is a part-time person, works as a sales guy for some company, you know, uses the technology at the local pizza shop to actually do his job. And you just hear stories. I mean, people were out of their minds, and they said, we've been talking to people about this forever, and it doesn't get done. And so when we talked to people who were supposed to be working on it, they said, well, they don't want to pay for it. They don't like the offering. They say that, but they're not that interested in really doing it. So, yeah, they ended up leaving. But what was really interesting about this was when we actually talked to the people, what they didn't like was the proposal, the single model that the state had made available to them. So what we did was we said, fine, you don't like that one, we'll give you a menu. We gave them 6. We talked to the internet service providers, the utilities, and the other players who had to be part of actually making it work. And we said to them, which model, you know, let's come up with a bunch of models, and they can choose from those models. So once we gave them 6 models to choose from, people chose the one that made the most sense for their community. It wasn't that they didn't want it or they wouldn't pay for it. It was we gave them one size, that's it. And when we gave them 6 different choices, like a menu, it was easy. Everybody signed up. And then the work of doing greenfield on this is really hard because the utilities, the construction folks, the internet service providers, they're used to expanding on an existing footprint. There's a ton of coordination and getting together that's required to make this happen. You know, you can't start to drill the hole until this other thing happens, and you can't put the pole in until this other thing happens, and you can't start to string the lines until, I mean, it's really messy and complicated. And so the lieutenant governor basically held a meeting once a month in her office in the State House where all of the players had to come in and explain how much work they'd done on getting to where they were supposed to be on this. And by the time the pandemic happened, when you really needed broadband, okay, I would say somewhere in the vicinity of 40, 45 of them had it. And then the rest of them we finished up in 21 and 22. And I have one more story I have to tell because we had a celebration for this in Western Mass when we finally got the final town lit up. And there was a guy who spoke there who said that he grew up in the West Coast. He was I can't remember exactly what he did. He worked for a life science company in San Francisco. His wife was from one of these small towns in Western Mass. She wanted to move back. They moved back. He got a job working at UMass. And they had 2 kids. And he hated the broadband thing. It made him insane. But he worked at UMass, so he basically just went to UMass whenever he needed to have serious access to the internet. And then she got breast cancer and she passed away. And so now he needed to raise the 2 girls, but he didn't have the ability to go to UMass anymore. So, and he didn't have access to broadband. So, you know, he was really scrapping for work. And he got deeply involved in trying to make this whole internet thing happen. And he had come to the conclusion that his kids were going to graduate from high school, maybe from college before it ever happened. And the whole thing was heartbreaking for him. And then he got really involved in what we were doing, and we got the broadband in place, and he got a job. And he got a job working with a company in the life science space in Cambridge. And that company was working on a cure for breast cancer. So, and there was not a dry eye in the building by the time he got done with that story. But, you know, if you live in Eastern Mass, you can't even begin to appreciate how lost these folks felt. And I really do consider it to be one of the, and the fact we got most of it done before the pandemic started. And you know, you couldn't sell a home, you couldn't start a business. I mean, there were so many things you could not do in this really beautiful part of Massachusetts that now you can. And it's made a huge difference.
I'm going to ask permission that we go to 10 of, and then do, okay, great. And I want to switch gears right now, if it's okay with you all. And you have a new job.
I do.
Yep. Okay. Some would say you went from the fire into the frying pan. I've been with you several times as you took on new roles, and I've always been impressed with how I'm skipping over Health Connector because the governor talked about that earlier.
That was what Lewis did, which
Yes.
was unbelievable.
And I'm skipping over the, although you can come back to this always if you want to, but if you want to talk about COVID for a second.
Well, there was 65 metrics. They did a study of all 50 states. We finished just behind Hawaii, which I always thought was kind of unfair because it's an island. And it's like, you know, warm weather most of the time. And we're neither of those things. And, but we, you know, the Commonwealth, based on this study, which was the most comprehensive study I think anybody did really well. And I think that's a real tribute to the people of Massachusetts more than anything else.
Tough, tough, tough. So here's this guy, right? Why'd you choose this job? What are the new lessons for you at the NCAA? What's the same? And tell us what's going on. For me, every time I hear about the portal, I think of like Star Trek or something. So,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
tell us why you chose.
That would be interesting.
Yeah. So, why'd you take the job? What have you learned? What's going on?
I was planning to spend my post-governor time doing stuff like this with Steve and the book. And in late October of 22, I got a phone call from Sam Kennedy, who was then the CEO of the Boston Red Sox, and he said, I just talked to this guy who's doing a search for the next president for the NCAA, and as he was describing it, I thought of you, but I didn't want to put your name in until I talked to you. And I said, Sam, I'm flattered, but I haven't been in higher education, I haven't been in college sports, I don't really understand why you would think that. And he said, well, I just did. So if you could read the job description and let me know if you're interested in this, call me back. So he sent me the job description. I gave it to Lauren, my wife, because she just finished 8 years of all that came with the public life, the protests outside the house, and everything else. And I said, can you read this and say what you think about it? Do you think this makes any sense? And so she read it, and she looked up at me when she finished it, and she, basically said, oh, shit. This does sound a lot like you. And it was because the NCAA is basically a distributed decision-making model. It's got 180 committees that make policy on behalf of the membership, and And it is, in many respects, a very complicated organization, not unlike government. And they really wanted someone who had firsthand experience in college sports. Two of our boys played football in college. Lauren was a gymnast at Northwestern. She's the best athlete in the family. And we have tons and tons of friends and colleagues and their kids who, some of which wouldn't have graduated from high school, much less graduated from college if it wasn't for sports. So I took a shot at it and I got the job. And I knew they had huge problems. I mean, they've had huge problems for a long time. And we're in the process of trying to right some of those. But it's a really complicated decision-making structure. And the challenges there are multiple. There are operational challenges, there are organizational challenges, there are legal challenges, and there's huge diversity there. I mean, you're talking about schools that spend $300 million on college sports and schools that spend $5 million and everything in between. It's a monstrous network. There are roughly 1,100 schools across 3 divisions and 510,000 student athletes. And I think some of the stuff we're doing, if we can get through these reforms that we're currently chasing, will create a much more appropriately diverse way of organizing what we're up to. But we still have a lot of work to do there, and it's been enormously challenging because this is a job where you have influence, right? This is a job, not that one, but this is a job where you have authority. Makes a big difference. But I really do love the kids. I've spent a ton of time with young people, thousands of them, and I've told many of them that they kind of restore my faith in the future when I talk to them about, how they think about things, why they are the way they are, what it is they're choosing to study, how they got interested in the sport they're playing, and they're just, you'd like to bring them all home. And that for me has really been the best part of the job. It's a constant reminder about why I'm trying to fix this thing in the first place.
What sport or event surprised you that you liked it so much?
He's a soccer player. Obviously, the men's and women's soccer championships this year were both awesome. Vermont winning the national championship in soccer was a bit of a surprise, to put it mildly. And the finals between North Carolina and Wake Forest on the women's side basically came down to a free kick. I mean, it was an absolute back and forth, and UNC won it on a free kick with about 3 minutes to play. One of the best football games I ever saw in my life was a D3 football game. It was a championship. It was played in Salem, Virginia. It was between Cortland, which is in upstate New York, and North Central Illinois. And they had both pounded the bejesus out of everybody they'd played that year. 2 really big, tough teams, just bang, bang, bang. And so they both came out and tried to bully each other, right? And so the score at halftime was what you would expect, which was 7-3. Neither one of them could actually bully the other, but neither one of them believed they couldn't eventually bully them. And with like 6 minutes left in the third quarter, it was 10-7. And it was just this slog fest going on. And then both teams sort of looked up and said, well, maybe we should try to pass the ball and see what happens. And they scored 60 points in the next 18 minutes. The final score was 37-36. And the game ended with about a minute left. North Central scored to make it 37-36, and they decided to go for 2 and play for the win. And Cortland stopped them and won the game 37-36. And honestly, D3, it was one of the coolest sports events I've ever been at. And for me, the biggest benefit of the whole thing is when you talk to these kids. Like I did a big thing last year with a bunch of women basketball players at the Women's Final Four in Cleveland. And, questions about all kinds of things. But this one woman raised her hand and she said, "Can you help me understand how I can use my experience as an athlete in a job interview?" So I looked at her and I said, "Do you think you're a team player?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Can you have difficult conversations with your teammates and your coach about why things aren't working the way they're supposed to work and how they can get better?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Can you take criticism, constructive criticism from your peers and your coaches about how you're doing without, starting a fight?" And she said, "Yeah." And I just sort of went through a list. Do you believe that, most things in life you have to work really hard for and that the grind is what really matters and you can't get to the top of the mountain without being willing to start at the bottom? And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Just walk into a job interview and just say all of those things that you just said in response to what I asked you and you will be fine." I think some of the most interesting thing, there's a certain innocence that a lot of these kids have about what they've actually learned. And I constantly run into people who played sports, and Steve, you played them, and I did. And the biggest lessons you learn in sports, you don't necessarily learn while you're playing, unless you're really paying attention. You just discover them later on. And that's a huge part of why I think 90%, last survey that was done, 90% of the women in C-suites in America played college sports. It's a really good thing. And I'm trying very hard to make sure that it continues to be a really good thing.
Okay, back to politics. You did, when you were leaving office, you were asked by the Kennedy School to give the Godkin Lecture, which is a very big deal. Edwin Godkin was the founder of The Nation and the publication. And
George Washington was the founder of The Nation.
Thank you. The publication and the Nation was intended to be one of the follow-ons to the Liberator, and
it was the follow-on to the Liberator.
To the publication, yeah. And so, beginning in 1903, I think it's annual, but the Godkin Lecture has been given. People have been giving it, a bunch of famous people, a bunch of prestigious people, including you. So, your lecture focused on the dynamics of a changing electorate, and just pulling some of the stats that you read. In '88, 37% of the electorate identified as Democrats, 32 identified as Republicans, 31 as independents. About 2007, you said, the percentage identifying as independents began to rise. And then since 2012, independents have represented 44 to 46% of the electorate, Democrats 29 to 30, and Republicans 24 to 25. That's a ton of movement, millions of voters. In Massachusetts, and you can talk about this,
this is what I said then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In 2021, 32% were Democrats, 10% were Republicans, and 58% were independents. So,
by the way, the number in Mass is over 60.
So
the independents represent.
Should we do a quick poll here, guys? Show of hands.
I don't know if it's a big enough sample size. What do you think?
Well, we can try. Democrats registered. Okay. Independents.
Yeah, there you go.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
Republicans, Rob, where are you? No. Okay.
But the reason I talked about this was
because my question to you is, does all this movement in party registration, do you think there's a viable independent party? Do you think there are multiple parties possible? You are such a bridge builder, a listener, a believer in our democratic institutions. How do you see the political dynamics in this nation right now?
Well, I think the most interesting thing to me about this, right, those numbers, by the way, are continuing to move in that direction. There's three things that come with this, right? The first is you have a smaller and smaller universe of voters who are actually selecting nominees, right? I mean, there are a bunch of states like Massachusetts where you have open primaries, but I think it's about half and half that have open primaries. There in most, I think in around, I'm pretty sure around 25 of the states, you don't have open primaries. So if you're not registered as a Republican or a Democrat, you can't vote in the primary. So the universe is smaller, and I think that has a real impact on the way people think about how they run. And in places where you have open primaries or really big independent groups, it's a very different kind of race. And the challenge, the real challenge this creates, I think, over time, is where do these people go, right? Where do they fit? And one of the other things that was in that was a poll, and this thing is, I can't remember. You'd have to watch it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, it's YouTube.
Which is awful. So
yeah,
what we will do is we will send these guys the hard copy of it, and if anybody wants it, they can ask for it. There's a lot of information in there that was tied to a poll that the New York Times did with Siena College, and I thought the findings in the poll were really interesting. And I thought the way the Times presented the findings was also really interesting. For example, one of the things in the poll that didn't get much attention, the thing that got the most attention in the poll was the fact that a lot of people, majority of people in the country, were really down on our political process. And this was right before this is like 10 days before the election in 22.
Yeah, 22.
But what they didn't talk about was the fact that the questions that followed that were about, do you think it's fixable? And they broke it up in independents, Republicans, and Democrats. And the overwhelming majority in all three parties said it was fixable. Do you think it's fixable within the existing political structure? Yes. Are you going to buy into the results of the election in 22? Democrat, Republican, Independent, all three, majority of their voters said yes. All right? So when I'm looking at this poll, and I'm seeing an enormous amount of comedy, C-O-M-I-T-Y, among voters across all three stripes, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, yet the entire story that was written in the Times was about the differences. And I think one of the things that we have lost in some respects in our public discourse is the ability to do what my parents did, which was to focus on the stuff people agree on. And I continue to believe to this day that most people agree on most things. And the biggest challenge we face is that's just not very interesting. And so we end up with a political discourse that seems to be just the opposite. And I don't know what it means for sort of how people run or where they run, but I will say this: I think if you look at most municipal races and most state races, they end up being a lot less partisan because, generally speaking, you have to do stuff and be successful at it, and you have to be able to work with others to get something done, and you're going to be judged on that ultimately. And I think this does raise questions about whether or not at some point there will be a different way of playing the game at the national level.
Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. So it's a new year. It's also a new generation. And so my last question to you.
Is that one of your grandchildren?
No. As far as I know.
I thought you were making a sale there.
No. Last question. It's really your closing question for this. We might have a minute or two to ask questions from the audience, but please share some final thoughts about public service and what each of us can do.
So one of the things I say all the time about public service, and I say it to a lot of these young people that I talk to, and I also say it when I go give talks at business schools or colleges, is public service, you will grow more if you spend time in public service than on almost anything else you can do. And the reason for that is you will get so outside your traditional circle of friends, colleagues, neighbors, coworkers, and all the rest. And you will spend a lot of time around people whose life and personal experiences are completely different than your own. I say all the time that I am a really different person at the age of 68 than I was at the age of sort of 54 or 52, whenever it was I ran the first time. And that's because of the folks I've gotten to know and the stories I've heard and the kind of perspectives on life that people have, which when you're playing in the public sphere, you're going to spend time with a lot of people who live very different lives than you do. And if you're listening, if you're doing that, if you're doing what my mother said and my dad said, and your transmitter is off and your receiver is on, you will grow. I mean, it is nothing like anything else I've ever done. And especially at the state and local level, you get to actually see what you do. That broadband stuff, we got to see that as it was happening. You know, when it was taking too long, we were like, I can't believe how long this is taking. And they said, well, you know, the pounding, you know, you got to pound those telephone poles into bedrock in a lot of those hill towns, and it's really hard. I'm like, blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine, show me. So you go out there and you watch how hard it is to pound the bedrock to put the poles in, and you come away and say, okay, it's going to take a while. But there's really nothing like the opportunity for you know, personal growth that comes from being willing to spend time in that public square. And I'm not somebody who thinks the public square is for everybody, but I definitely believe if you have an itch, there's just no better way to scratch it than to spend time serving your community, serving your commonwealth, or serving some group that's important to you. And it will make you better. It just will. And I think sometimes people think it makes you worse because it's hard and it's challenging, it's difficult, and there's a lot of different points of view. And I come at it from just the opposite, which is that's actually what makes it beautiful and interesting.
So thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Allison, do we have time for some questions from the audience?
Okay. I'll ask that you ask the question through the microphone.
Yeah, who would like to ask a question?
You pick, Steve.
The man who first put his hand up right there.
Thank you. My question is about the portal. Has it got out of control when a team that wins a bowl game, subsequently 30 to 40 players say, I'm going to go into the portal on a football team? That to me seems like it's not in the spirit, I think, of what the portal was intended to be.
So you're right. So there's a couple things going on here. One is the best way I can describe this is to say that the NCAA used to have a lot of rules that were designed to create stability and predictability and competitive balance, right, between and among the schools, coaches, kids, and all the rest. And little by little, over the course of about 10 years, the courts have chipped away at this stuff. And the courts have said, what you call competitive equity or what you call balance or what you call predictability is in fact a restraint on opportunity. So, no, you can't do that. And so almost all the rules associated with transfers are just out the window. Now, what's also really interesting about this, and this is a great example of where culture crashes into law, or vice versa, law crashes into culture. About 35% of all the kids who go to college now transfer at least once. Now, when I went to college, which was literally a million years ago, you didn't really know what was going on in anybody else's school. You wrote letters, right, to your friends, and they would write letters back to you, and or sometimes you could get on the dorm phone if you were lucky, but a long distance call costs like, more than you had. And so first time you'd actually really get a sense about what other people's collegiate experience was like was when you go home and watch the Thanksgiving Day football game after your freshman year, right? So that is not the world that today's young people live in, right? They live in a world where an hour on their phone or an hour on an iPad, and they can tell you everything about everything at 10 different colleges, right? Usually through direct conversations with kids on the campuses too. So the fact that 35% of kids transfer at least once, who aren't even in sports, right? These are just kids, right? By definition, when we show up in front of a judge and say, there's a reason why we're trying to help these kids create a predictable and growth opportunity, the judge is like, no. We think these kids, just like everybody else, should be able to transfer the same way other kids can transfer. And so the portal is basically about trying to create a rule set for this, and it serves that purpose. But it does make it really hard on schools and teams because a lot of kids do move. And but it's not 30%. It's less than that. But what's really, this is why all these conversations with kids on campus are so fascinating. You talk to a lot of kids on campus who play college sports, and they're not wild about the portal. And the reason they're not wild about the portal is because it breaks up their team. The ones that stay, they kind of like the culture they were building and like the kids they were playing with. Now, our solution to this, I hope, will be this settlement we negotiated with plaintiffs in 4 or 5 different lawsuits that all related to various versions of this, but are going to make it possible for the schools in D1, which is really where this issue exists. There's a little bit of it in D2 and D3, but nothing like D1. Which is going to give the schools the ability to do institutional NIL and to basically write what I would call a development agreement with a student athlete. So here's what we're going to work on academically, here's what we're going to work on developmentally, and here's what we're going to work on athletically. And that's our contract and our commitment to you. And it's sort of an extension of the post-eligibility insurance program we put in place, the guaranteed scholarship. You keep your scholarship whether you play or not, and your scholarship's good for 10 years if that's what it takes for you to get your degree. The mental health and well-being benefits that need to be available. We got preliminary approval from the judge on this in October, and she set a final approval date for April. And it's our hope that she will approve this, and at that point in time, the schools will have the ability to develop a different kind of relationship with kids. You're still going to have kids transferring, but I don't think it will be quite like what it's been. And the other thing we've done is, does anybody know, by the way, this is one of the fun little facts I've learned. The federal government, when they tell you what the federal graduation rate is, that's the graduation rate for kids who stayed at the same school for 4 years. So if you leave and transfer to a different school, remember 35% of the kids are transferring, they're gone, they disappear. So when they say the graduation rate is 64%, that's 64% of the kids who started as freshmen and stayed. Okay, so the ones who moved, right, they may have graduated from someplace else, but the feds don't keep track of them. So the thing we've been building for our own student athletes is something we're calling a graduation passport. And we're going to keep track of everybody everywhere they go, and there's going to be a bit of a requirement that's going to be on the schools the kids transfer to with an obligation to help them make up for any of the credits they might have lost when they transferred. So that, because our graduation rates are really good. I mean, student athletes graduate across all 3 divisions at a higher rate than non-student athletes, almost across the board. The one twerk in the data is because we have so many more kids of color as a percent of our total than the college population overall. We're 1 point behind on the total, right? But our actual numbers, white men to white men, white women to white women, black men to black men, black women to black women, Hispanic men, Hispanic women, I mean, to what? You look at that stuff, we're killing it. And I don't want to lose that because of the portal.
We're
And I
glad
do
that
worry
still
about that.
matters to you. I don't know if there's time for one more question, and if it could not be on the NCAA. So right here. Thank you.
Not on the NCAA.
Charlie, we need you. Can we beg you to run for president?
That's my wife. That's really sweet. Thank you. You know, being in public life is hard on other people in your family. You know, I mean, the hours are nuts and all the rest, but, you know, then you also have, like, people protesting outside your house, and it's, you know, I would never say never to anything associated with public life, because, I mean, he and I have spent together, you know, 16 years in it. It's hugely important to me, but it would have to be like a real family decision, because it's challenging with respect to that. You get, when you're doing the work, you get the benefit of the work. You get the burden of the public face and all the rest, but you get the benefit of the work. What your family gets is the burden of the job, and that's about it. They don't get much of the benefit of the work. But thank you. That was really sweet. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Lisa, I don't want to keep people. So, Lisa, do you want to wrap us up, or do you want? It's
One more short question, and then we can adjourn to book signing and a little reception.
okay. It's a right here.
She's coming.
So you talked about having productive conversations with your parents when you were growing up, and I'm wondering for people in my generation, for the Gen Zers out there, so many people nowadays are having conversations over social media, and they end up being really not productive and quite unkind. Is it worth having discussions where we're not listening to each other and we're only saying things to speak online, or should we just transition off of social media dialogue and try and promote more in-person conversations as a better alternative, because social media has those downfalls?
That's a really good question. I mean, the whole presence of social media was, you know, from the time I ran for the first time in 10 to the time I ran for the third time in 18, you could see the difference that social media was starting to have. And I think you know, do you guys one of the things I talked about in my Godkin lecture was David Bowie's interview in the 1990s about the internet. I mean, the guy totally nailed it. He said the internet is going to be both awesome and terrifying. And in the 90s, rock and roll guy, you know? Really smart. And he basically said one of the big problems or one of the things that's going to make it terrifying is the fact that there are going to be multiple sources of truth. And that is exactly kind of where we are. So I give David Bowie huge credit for figuring this out long before the rest of us. I'm a big believer that the in-person stuff is always better, because it's harder. It really is harder to ignore what the other person is trying to say in a face-to-face conversation than it is when you're doing it online. And online oftentimes feels like people are just trying to win, whatever that is, you know, and the so-called hot take or the big put-down or whatever it might be. And the other thing that's a little challenging with social media is it's short form, like really short form. And one of the great things about, conversations or books or long form journals and that kind of stuff, and now I sound a little bit like a wonk, and I know that, is you can get a bigger and better appreciation of something. And, my kids, who are 34, 30, and 27, they all got for Christmas from each other, and they gave Lauren and me something called a brick, which is a device that actually blocks your social media feeds, apps on your phone. And everybody at this point is using them. And I don't mean everybody, I mean our family, everybody. And everybody has agreed that it's really changed the way we use time and the way we engage. And the other thing I have to say, and this is probably the wrong book to say this with, but the beauty of a book, okay, is it takes you someplace and it puts you there for an extended period of time. And there's imagination and self-reflection and all sorts of other things that come with long forms that I think we haven't taken from you guys, but we've made it harder for you to get there. And I learned more from some of the books that I've read in my life than about certain subjects that I've learned anywhere else. I mean, and I think I think part of the shorthand that comes with social media can be useful in some respects, but at the exclusion of everything else, I think it's a real big problem. Yeah.
Thank you so very much.